YouTube, long time no see. Now this is going to be a bit of response to the Super Atheist Brothers, who henceforth I'll call Mario because of, you know. Now the argument raises a mix of several different arguments aiming to cast skepticism on the eyewitness accounts of the resurrection, the testimony of. Mario sums his position nicely between 551 and 623, but for the sake of time I'm going to leave that in the description unread, so please take 10 seconds to read it now. Now concisely, Mario perceives a problem between the acceptability of one testimony over another. Christians would hesitate to believe some physical possible event with a good testimony, which he would define as recent, has consensus among the testimony, has many witnesses, and you know the witnesses personally, but they would believe a supernatural claiming lacking such a testimony, which is in Mario's point of view, that is. However, for me, this argument suffers from at least two large problems, namely, one, the argument assumes that the resurrection is at an epistemic disadvantage compared to other testimonies, and two, the argument falsely denotes the eyewitness testimony of the resurrection as poor. Now let me address both of these issues in greater detail. The first and lesser issue I have with Mario's conclusion is the assumption that a report of a miracle, by definition, is at a disadvantage compared to another quote-unquote typical report of some other event. Now such an argument mirrors Hume's argument against miracles in his essay, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, wherein Hume suggests that there's a contest of two opposite experiences. However, if one holds such an assumption, it is difficult to see how this is not begging the question in favor of naturalism. Following William Paley's counter-argument against Hume, Paley says that a narrative of a fact can only be said to be contrary to experience if we, being at the time and place in question, observe that the alleged event did not in fact take place. Otherwise, we are simply assuming that such events are contrary to experience, thus begging the question. Moreover, there is direct testimony of the resurrection of Jesus, which is more powerful than the indirect and inductive nature of our observation that a dead man typically remain dead. This specific miracle requires that the witness have the ability to distinguish between a man who is dead and a man who is alive, which should be safe to say every human being is able to distinguish. The second and more important issue I have with this conclusion is the attack on the reliability of the eyewitnesses and their testimony of the resurrection. Now specifically, the testimony is said to be antiquated, lacking in consensus among witnesses, which we have never met, by the way, and said witnesses are not known to be trustworthy. Now please pay careful attention here, because if you take anything away from this video, this should be it. When discussing the resurrection, in order to offer an explanation of the facts, for example, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the conversion of Paul, your hypothesis must be explanatory and comparative, meaning that your hypothesis should explain all the facts and should be more probable than rival hypotheses. Thus, an attack on the trustworthiness of the eyewitnesses, for example, must have a big enough explanatory scope to account for their deceit as well as be more probable than say that they were telling the truth. Having clarified this point, in response to Mario's attack on the eyewitnesses, I have four thoughts. First, you can't exclusively focus on the eyewitness testimony while ignoring the context the testimony is given in. Such a move would remove crucial information about the trustworthiness and nature of that testimony. Now consider a murder case where the police are collecting a statement from a wife of a murder victim. Assume that they are collecting the report an hour after the wife has discovered the body of her dead husband, and the police are having a difficult time interviewing the wife, who is leaving out details and sobbing uncontrollably. Now if we ignore the emotional context of the situation, then the testimony of the wife will appear untrustworthy because she's leaving out details, etc. But if the emotional context is given credence, then trustworthiness of the wife is put in better light. The same can be said of the eyewitness testimony of the resurrection. Both the emotional and cultural contexts can aid in a broader picture. If both contexts are ignored, then important details slip through the cracks, like the Jewish view of women testimony. That is, women were not considered credible witnesses, yet they are recorded as the first witnesses. Or emotional context in which Jesus' empty tomb was discovered, the witnesses were not in a state of excitement or euphoria, or were they looking for to see wonders, but instead the women were going to anoint a dead body, and the apostles were hiding in fear and skepticism in the case of Thomas. Such information is contrary to hypothesis of conspiracy and fraud. Now second, the relation of the testimony to the event is more important than the age of the testimony. And I'll say that again. the relation of the testimony to the event is more important than the age of the testimony. The fact that the eyewitness testimony of the resurrection is 2,000 years old has no bearing on whether it should be trusted or not. Such a focus would be erroneously focusing on the age of the testimony instead of the testimony to the event. Thus, there is good evidence, both textual and verbal, that demonstrate the concise and rapid acceptance of the testimony of the eyewitnesses, establishing that testimony was indeed recent. Otherwise, we would need to reject the whole of past history since it's not quote-unquote recent. Third, while not having met the eyewitnesses, we can easily infer their trustworthiness and see that comparatively this has greater explanatory scope. For example, as discussed earlier, the context in which the eyewitnesses testified was extremely hostile. Thus, we have a key distinction between the believability of Mario's testimony of having been Laden captured in his basement and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, namely that the eyewitnesses of the resurrection were persecuted and killed for their claim, whereas Mario will most certainly not be. You will most certainly not be killed, Mario, for making the claims that you suggest in your videos, whereas the apostles were, in fact. Moreover, besides being tortured and killed for their testimony, the eyewitnesses have no motive for lying. In addition, several disciples wrote honestly in their Gospels, keeping embarrassing information in, for example, betrayal, running away, being embarrassed, having fear, etc. Third, the probability of the women lying is also very low, since they would have known that in Jewish society their word would have been questioned or dismissed. And fourth, the probability of Paul lying is equally improbable in light of his hate for Christians, his rising status among the Jews, and again, his lack of motive and the malignant context in which he testified. Thus, the claim that the eyewitnesses were not known to be trustworthy seems both very improbable and lacks explanatory scope. They simply did not have the motive for such an action, and therefore it is more probable that they were telling the truth. Fourth, a perfect consensus among eyewitnesses suggests collusion. I'll say that again. A perfect consensus among eyewitnesses suggests collusion. In law enforcement, and law especially, it has been long recognized that minor discrepancies among witnesses does not invalidate the testimony, but instead offers an argument against establishing a story beforehand. As Thomas Starkey stresses, quote, "The unusual character of human testimony is substantial truth under circumstantial variety. In other words, there will be a common core fact with discrepancy about detail. Had each and every witness said the same thing about the details revolving around the events of Jesus' resurrection, then we would no doubt expect collusion. Thus, the fact that they all state the same common core of facts while differing on details strengthens their testimony instead of weakening it." So to conclude and reiterate, when discussing the resurrection, one needs to offer an explanation that incorporates all the facts revolving around the events, as well as establishing a hypothesis that is more likely than other hypotheses, given the salient facts, those being the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the conversion of Paul, etc. So to answer Mario's question, I disagree that the testimony is less than desired as demonstrated above, and as a Christian, I believe the testimony of the eyewitnesses of the resurrection because I believe it has the greatest explanatory scope in contrast to other hypotheses. In fact, I see no motive for them to lie, and not only that, but also a strong defeater for such a thought via the malignant context they testified in. Peace.